Before I tell you what happened, let me say this. If someone had walked up to me 5 years ago and said a bunch of people living behind a fancy stone entrance would accidentally turn my old family ranch into the most profitable piece of land in 3 counties, I would have laughed and gone back to feeding cattle. But life has a strange way of rewarding patience and punishing arrogance. They thought they were destroying an eyesore. They ended up financing one that nobody could ignore. My name is Cole Mercer. I'm 53 years old, born and raised outside Red Mesa, New Mexico, where the wind never stops and the land teaches you lessons nobody else can. My grandfather used to say that people who inherit money think they own the world, but people who inherit dirt understand they're only borrowing it from the next generation. That ranch has been in my family longer than anyone still alive can remember. 280 acres of dry grass, stubborn mesquite trees, a creek that only remembered how to flow after heavy storms, and right in the middle of the highest ridge stood an old cedar barn. It wasn't beautiful in the way magazines define beautiful. The paint had faded years ago. One side leaned just enough to make visitors nervous, and every board carried scratches from decades of hard work. But every Christmas my father hung lanterns there. Every spring calves were born inside those walls, and every summer my cousins and I climbed into the loft pretending we were outlaws hiding from the sheriff. You couldn't put a price on memories like that. Then Progress arrived, wearing polished boots and expensive sunglasses. A developer bought thousands of acres next to my property and built a community called Silver Canyon Preserve. They advertised luxury desert living, breathtaking sunsets, private walking trails, and exclusive hilltop views. They sold 400 homes to people escaping crowded cities, promising peace, privacy, and nature without mentioning that nature already belonged to somebody else. At first we stayed out of each other's way. Their residents waved from expensive golf carts while I drove my dusty pickup through cattle gates. Some were friendly enough. Others looked at my ranch the way someone looks at an old pickup parked beside a brand new sports car. You could almost hear them wondering why anyone would keep something so outdated. The Homeowners Association elected a president named Grant Holloway. He was probably in his mid-40s, always wearing press shirts even on weekends, always talking like every conversation was a board meeting. The first time he visited, he smiled so much my dog didn't trust him. He stood near the fence, looked toward my barn, and said, "Mr. Mercer, you have an incredible property. That structure, though, it blocks what could be one of the finest panoramic views in the county." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He explained that several homeowners had complained that the barn interrupted photographs from their back patios. He called it an aesthetic issue. I called it my family's history. He offered me $3,000 to relocate it somewhere lower on my land. $3,000. I looked at the old building my grandfather built with his brothers after returning from military service, then looked back at him and said, "You couldn't move it for $30,000, and if you could, I still wouldn't let you." His smile faded just enough for me to notice. "Sometimes communities have to make difficult improvements for the greater good," he replied. I remember wiping dust off my gloves and saying, "Good thing this isn't your community then." He climbed into his SUV and left without another word. My ranch hand, Luis, watched him drive away and asked if we should worry. I shrugged. Rich people complain all the time. That's what rich people do. They complain until someone tells them no, then they usually find something else to complain about. I figured that would be the end of it. For the next couple of weeks, life went on. We repaired fencing after a storm, vaccinated calves, argued about baseball over sandwiches, and forgot all about Grant Holloway. Looking back now, that's probably the last peaceful stretch I had before everything changed. One Thursday morning, I drove into town to pick up feed and hydraulic parts for the tractor. The trip should have taken 2 hours. Instead, halfway through loading supplies, my phone buzzed. It was a picture from Luis. At first, I couldn't understand what I was seeing because the angle was strange. Then I noticed a pile of shattered cedar beams, twisted metal roofing, and a yellow bulldozer sitting where my family's barn had stood my entire life. The message underneath contained only 4 words. "Boss, you better hurry." I don't remember paying for the feed. I don't remember the drive back. All I remember is the dust cloud rising over my ranch before I reached the gate and the strange silence waiting for me on the hill where generations of my family had left pieces of themselves. The barn was gone, reduced to broken lumber scattered across the ground, while men in reflective vests loaded debris onto trailers as if they were cleaning up trash instead of erasing history. And standing there with a clipboard in his hand was Grant Holloway, calm enough to make my blood run cold. Grant looked over as my truck skidded to a stop, and instead of the apology any decent man might have offered, he adjusted his sunglasses and gave me the kind of smile people wear when they think money has already solved the problem. "Mr. Mercer," he said, almost cheerfully, "I was hoping we'd have a chance to discuss compensation." Compensation. That word echoed in my head while I climbed out of the truck and walked past him without saying a thing. I stepped onto the dirt where the old barn had stood for nearly 80 years. The foundation stones were cracked. Old beams my grandfather had cut by hand were stacked like firewood, and the heavy cedar doors that had survived storms, droughts, and even a small grass fire were splintered into pieces under bulldozer tracks. Luis stood nearby looking sick to his stomach. One of the equipment operators quietly removed his hard hat and looked away. Even he seemed to realize something terrible had happened. Grant followed me and began explaining that the structure had been considered obsolete, that his contractors believe an agreement had already been reached through community discussions, and that they intended to improve everyone's property values. I finally turned around and asked one simple question. "Did I ever tell you that you could touch my barn?" He hesitated for half a second before saying, "Well, we assumed cooperation would be in everyone's best interest." I nodded once. "That's not what I asked." He didn't answer because he couldn't. He knew exactly what they had done. I could have started yelling. I could have called the sheriff immediately. I could have done a dozen emotional things that would have made me feel better for 5 minutes and solved absolutely nothing. Instead, I told Luis to photograph everything. Every tire track, every broken beam, every machine serial number, every contractor logo. Then I walked back to my house, pulled out the old metal filing cabinet that belonged to my father, and found the original property survey. My grandfather had been obsessive about paperwork. Every boundary marker, every easement, every deed amendment was documented and preserved. By sunset, I knew exactly what I suspected. The barn sat entirely on my land, nowhere near the property line, and nobody had any legal authority to remove it. The county survey confirmed it. The demolition wasn't a misunderstanding. It was trespassing and destruction of private property. My attorney, Rebecca Lawson, drove out the next morning carrying a legal pad and wearing boots that looked far too clean for ranch country. She spent 2 hours examining the site before looking at me and saying, "Cole, they have a problem. The question is whether you want them to have a small problem or a very expensive one." I smiled for the first time since the demolition. "Let's see what expensive looks like." She laughed, but then asked if there was anything unusual about this ridge because she noticed utility markers along the road. That's when a memory surfaced. About 18 months earlier, a telecommunications company had contacted me asking whether I'd consider leasing part of the hilltop. They wanted to study it as a possible location for a regional communications tower because the elevation covered an enormous area. I had declined almost immediately because the old barn occupied the exact location they preferred, and I wasn't interested in tearing down family history for a monthly check. Rebecca stopped writing and slowly looked toward the empty hill. "Do you still have their information?" I dug through my email archives that evening and found the contact. The next morning I made the call. A man named Daniel Pierce answered. He sounded surprised that I remembered him. I told him, "You asked about my ridge a while back. Things have changed." He asked what that meant. I looked out my kitchen window toward the empty foundation and replied, "Let's just say you've got an unobstructed hill now." There was a pause before he said he'd send an engineering team on Monday. They arrived in 2 white trucks carrying enough equipment to make my ranch look like a science project. They measured elevation, tested signals, flew drones, and spent nearly 4 hours studying the area. Daniel finally walked over with the biggest grin I'd seen all week. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "this location is extraordinary. We thought it was good before. Without that structure, this is one of the best natural elevations we've surveyed in the region." I folded my arms. "Can it help the nearby community?" He laughed. Help? It could improve service for thousands of people. I nodded slowly. Then tell me exactly how tall you'd build the tower. He named a height that made Luis whistle under his breath. I looked at the skyline, imagined a steel structure reaching into the desert air, and quietly said, "Go taller if the law allows." News travels fast in rural counties. Somehow Grant heard about the meeting before the engineers even left the property. My phone rang that evening. The second I answered, his voice exploded through the speaker. "You can't seriously be planning to build a communications tower." I leaned back in my chair and asked, "Why not?" "Because it would destroy the view for 400 homeowners." I couldn't help smiling. "Funny thing about that, you seemed comfortable destroying mine." He started talking about neighborhood standards, aesthetics, and community expectations. I interrupted him. "Grant, the only community that gets to decide what happens on my land is my family." He hung up without another word. Over the next week, his association launched every objection they could imagine. They hired consultants. They sent complaint letters. They circulated petitions claiming the tower would ruin wildlife, tourism, and property values. Rebecca answered each filing with calm precision. Agricultural zoning allowed utility infrastructure. Environmental reviews found no violations. County officials rejected their emergency requests one after another. At one hearing, Grant stood before the board insisting that such a structure would permanently alter the character of the landscape. The chairman looked over his glasses and asked, "Wasn't your association recently involved in removing a privately owned historic barn from that same landscape?" The room went silent. Grant's attorney quickly whispered something into his ear, and the subject changed. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened inside Silver Canyon Preserve. Residents started asking questions. Their cell service had always been terrible. Video calls dropped. Business meetings froze. Teenagers complained that they had to stand outside just to send messages. One real estate agent lost a client after a virtual tour disconnected 3 times. A doctor who worked remotely couldn't complete consultations without driving into town. Suddenly, people realized the proposed tower wasn't a threat. It was a solution. They also learned that the best location had always been my hill. At a grocery store, an elderly woman recognized me and quietly asked, "Are you the rancher with the tower?" I admitted I was considering it. She sighed and said, "I wish they'd just apologize to you. Half this neighborhood only wanted better service. Nobody told us they were tearing down your barn." That sentence stayed with me. Arrogance at the top had dragged hundreds of ordinary families into a fight they never asked for. The pressure inside the HOA grew by the day. Emergency meetings turned into shouting matches. Financial reports revealed mounting legal expenses. Contractors demanded payment. Insurance companies started asking uncomfortable questions about unauthorized demolition. Rebecca called one afternoon, sounding unusually pleased. "Cole," she said, "they've spent more trying to stop your project than it would have cost to rebuild your barn twice." I walked outside and stared at the empty hill where memories had once stood. The sadness was still there, but something else had replaced the anger. Patience. Because for the first time since that terrible afternoon, I realized the story wasn't going to end with what they took from me. It was going to end with what their own pride handed back. And just as the first steel trucks rolled onto my property under a bright desert sunrise, I noticed a black SUV climbing the ranch road toward my house. It wasn't the county. It wasn't the engineers. It was Grant himself. And for the first time since I'd met him, he wasn't wearing the confident smile that had started this whole mess. Grant climbed out of the SUV much slower than usual. The polished shoes were still there, the press shirt was still there, but the confidence had disappeared somewhere between the HOA clubhouse and my front gate. He stood beside his vehicle for a moment, looking past me toward the hill where crews were already unloading steel sections that would soon become the tallest structure for miles. The irony must have hit him harder than it hit me. A month earlier, he'd wanted to erase one old barn because it interrupted a scenic view. Now an entire communications tower was about to rise from the exact same spot. He cleared his throat and asked if we could talk privately. I looked over at Luis, who simply grinned and climbed back into his truck, leaving us alone. "You've made your point," Grant finally said. Maybe we can find a compromise. I folded my arms. You had a chance to compromise before your bulldozer showed up. He looked down at the dirt. Mistakes were made. That sentence almost made me laugh. People like Grant always call their own decisions mistakes after they realize someone else held the leverage. When ordinary folks make mistakes, they pay for them immediately. When powerful people make mistakes, they first try to negotiate. I invited him onto the porch, poured myself a cup of coffee, and let him sit there in silence. Sometimes silence is more uncomfortable than talk. Finally, he asked, "What will it take to settle this?" I reached inside, grabbed the folder Rebecca had prepared, and slid the box. He opened it and started. The first condition required the HOA to fully fund construction of a new cedar barn using quality materials and traditional craftsmanship that matched the original character as closely as possible. The second required payment for demolition damages, trespassing, legal expenses, and loss of use. The third established an annual maintenance contribution for the portion of ranch roads and fencing affected by construction traffic, payable by the association rather than individual homeowners. Grant flipped through the pages, his face getting tighter with every paragraph. Then he reached the final section and looked up at me. "You're serious?" I nodded. "Very." He pointed toward the hill. "And if we refuse?" I looked over my shoulder at the survey flags marking the future tower location and answered calmly. "Then construction continues exactly as planned, and every family who asks why they're staring at 80 feet of steel instead of an old wooden barn can have the complete story." He leaned back and rubbed his forehead. For the first time since this started, he seemed less like a powerful executive and more like a tired man realizing that pride can become very expensive. Over the following week, the negotiations moved faster than anyone expected. Rebecca handled the lawyers while I handled the cattle. Every evening she'd call with another update. The HOA insurance carrier wanted details. Their attorneys wanted estimates. Their financial committee wanted to know whether litigation could last years. Rebecca's answer never changed. "It certainly can." Meanwhile, the tower project kept moving. Concrete trucks arrived before sunrise. Steel beams followed. Workers climbed higher every day until the structure dominated the skyline. Drivers on the highway slowed down to look at it. Local businesses started talking about the improved coverage that would finally reach parts of the county that had struggled for years. One afternoon, I stopped beside the construction crew, and one of the foremen smiled and said, "You know, this location is going to help thousands of people." I looked at the foundation where my grandfather's barn once stood and quietly replied, "I wish it hadn't happened this way. But if something new had to rise here, at least it'll serve somebody." Not long after that, Grant returned carrying signed documents instead of arguments. He placed them on my kitchen table and said, "The board approved everything." There was no celebration, no dramatic handshake, just two men acknowledging that actions have consequences. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated and asked one final question. "Do you still think we're the bad guys?" I thought about that for a second. The truth was more complicated than internet comments usually allow. Most of the families inside that neighborhood had never wanted a fight. They simply trusted leaders who believed money and influence could replace respect. "No," I finally answered. "I think a handful of bad decisions turned decent neighbors into unwilling participants." He nodded once and walked away. A few Saturdays later, something happened that Luis still laughs about whenever he tells the story. I was repairing fencing along the south pasture when a pickup pulled in. Out stepped Grant, wearing jeans that had obviously never seen ranch work before. He walked over carrying a toolbox and said, almost awkwardly, "The maintenance committee thought helping with the fence would be a good gesture." I handed him a pair of gloves and pointed toward a stack of posts. By lunchtime, he had blisters on both hands and enough respect for hard labor that he stopped giving advice about land he didn't own. We didn't become friends, but we did become neighbors who understood each other a little better. Today, the new barn is nearly finished. It smells of fresh cedar instead of old dust, and my grandchildren already run through it the same way I once did. The communications tower stands above the ridge, quietly doing its job every hour of every day, connecting calls, supporting businesses, helping emergency services, and reminding everyone that sometimes the biggest victories don't come from revenge. They come from patience, paperwork, and letting arrogant people create their own problems. Every month, another lease payment arrives, and every time I deposit it, I think about my grandfather's favorite saying, "Never rush to fight a fool. Give him enough time, and he'll start working for you." Maybe that's exactly what happened here. Or maybe justice simply has a strange sense of